The morning mist hung heavy over Kensington Palace as Prince William sat in his private study, surrounded by memories that seemed to whisper from every corner. At 41, the future king carried himself with the same dignity his mother had possessed. Yet today, something different flickered in his eyes. After decades of silence, he was finally ready to share a secret that had shaped his entire adult life. The phone call from his private secretary had been brief but significant. The BBC documentary team was waiting, their cameras set up in the blue drawing room, where Diana had once hosted her most intimate conversations. William adjusted his tie, the same navy blue his mother had favored, and made his way down the corridor, lined with portraits of generations past. "Your Royal Highness, we're ready when you are," the director said softly, understanding the weight of what was about to be revealed. William nodded, settling into the wingback chair that had been his mother's favorite spot for reading bedtime stories to him and Harry. The red recording light blinked on, and suddenly the years melted away. William was 15 again, standing in the drawing room of Balmoral Castle on that terrible September morning in 1997. The Scottish Highlands had never felt so cold, so unwelcoming, despite the late summer warmth outside. "I remember the sound of gravel crunching under the wheels of the car that brought us the news," William began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of the boy he had once been. "Harry and I were still in our pajamas. We thought it was just another early morning call about royal duties, but this call was different. Charles, then the Prince of Wales, had answered with the formal composure expected of royalty. But William could see something breaking behind his father's eyes. The phone slipped slightly in Charles's hand as he listened to the voice on the other end, and in that moment, 15-year-old William knew their world had changed forever. The journey from Balmoral to London was a blur of motorcades and security briefings. William sat beside his younger brother Harry, both boys processing their mother's death in the way that only children can, with a mixture of disbelief and the strange acceptance that comes with shock. Charles sat across from them, his face a mask of controlled grief that would become all too familiar in the days ahead. "Father didn't cry in front of us during that journey," William recalled, his fingers unconsciously tracing the arm of his chair. "But I could see him struggling. He kept checking his watch. Not because he was impatient, but because time had become this strange, elastic thing that moved too fast and too slow, all at once." The media circus had already begun by the time they reached London. Flowers piled higher than a person's head outside Kensington Palace, and the crowds of mourners stretched as far as the eye could see. But for William, the most profound moments happened away from the cameras, in the quiet spaces where grief could breathe without performance. The first time William saw his mother's coffin was in the private chapel at St. James's Palace. The oak casket, draped with the royal standard and topped with white roses, seemed impossibly small to contain someone who had filled their lives so completely. Charles stood at the head of the coffin, his hand resting gently on the wood, and William could see his lips moving in what appeared to be a private conversation. "That's when I first heard him make the promise," William said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I was standing in the doorway, not wanting to intrude, but unable to leave. Father didn't know I was there." The promise itself would remain Charles's secret for another 26 years, whispered in a moment of raw vulnerability that no royal protocol could have prepared him for. But its effects would ripple through everything that followed. The way Charles raised his sons, the causes he championed, and the kind of king he would eventually become. In the documentary interview, William paused, looking out the window toward the gardens where he and Diana had once played hide-and-seek among the rose bushes. "People think they know our family's story because they've seen the public moments. The state funerals, the ceremonial duties, the official statements. But the real story happens in the quiet moments, when duty meets humanity, and something profound passes between people who love each other." The weight of what William was about to reveal hung in the air like morning fog, thick with the promise of clarity once the sun broke through. He had carried this secret through his own wedding, the births of his children, and his gradual assumption of royal responsibilities. But now, As his father wore the crown and the world watched a new generation of royals take center stage, it felt like time to honor both the promise and the woman who had inspired it. My mother always said that the monarchy's greatest strength was its ability to evolve while honoring the past, William continued. What my father whispered beside her coffin that day was a promise that would change how our family understood that evolution. It was a promise about duty, yes, but also about love, about healing, and about making sure that Diana's legacy lived on in ways that mattered. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, as William prepared to share the exact words that had shaped his understanding of what it meant to be royal, to be human, and to carry forward the best of those who came before. The secret was finally ready to emerge from the shadows, 26 years after it was first spoken in grief and love beside a mother's coffin. The chapel at St. James's Palace had fallen into that peculiar silence that comes when even the building itself seems to hold its breath. Charles stood alone beside Diana's coffin, unaware that his eldest son watched from the shadows of the doorway. The future king's shoulders sagged with a grief that royal training had never prepared him to carry. William remembered how his father's hand trembled slightly as it rested on the polished oak. Charles had always been a man of careful words, measured responses, and diplomatic precision. But in that moment, facing the woman who had been his wife, the mother of his children, and perhaps his greatest regret, formality crumbled away. "I promise you, Diana," Charles whispered, his voice barely audible even in the absolute quiet of the chapel, "that I will spend the rest of my life making sure our boys know how much you loved them. Every decision I make as their father will honor the mother you were to them." William felt his breath catch in his throat. He had expected his father to speak of duty, of the monarchy, of the constitutional implications of Diana's death. Instead, Charles was making a promise that was entirely personal, entirely human. But there was more. Charles leaned closer to the coffin, his forehead nearly touching the royal standard that draped across it. "And I promise that I will learn to love the way you loved. Openly. Without reservation. Without fear of what others might think. You taught me that the monarchy needs heart, not just tradition. I was too proud to listen then, but I hear you now." The words hit William like a physical blow. His parents' marriage had been played out in public, their differences dissected in newspapers and analyzed by commentators worldwide. But this was the first time William had heard his father acknowledge what Diana had been trying to bring to the royal family. A different way of being royal, that didn't require sacrificing humanity for duty. "I will make sure that when I am king, the monarchy serves the people with the same compassion you showed," Charles continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I will remember that behind every official engagement, every state function, every ribbon cutting, there are real people with real struggles. You saw them. I will learn to see them too." William pressed himself against the wall, overwhelmed by the intimacy of witnessing his father's raw vulnerability. This wasn't the composed Prince of Wales who attended cabinet meetings and delivered speeches. This was a man confronting his own failures while making promises he might spend decades trying to fulfill. Charles straightened up, but his hand remained on the coffin. "Most of all, Diana, I promise that I will never let anyone forget that you were more than just a tragic princess or a fairy tale gone wrong. You were a mother who crawled through minefields to make a point about war. You were a woman who held dying children because they needed to know they mattered. You were my wife who tried to teach me that being royal meant being human first." The chapel door creaked slightly as a guard shifted position outside, and Charles quickly wiped his eyes, composing himself with the practiced efficiency of a lifetime of public service. But the damage was done. Or perhaps, the healing had begun. William retreated to his room that night, carrying the weight of what he had overheard. The promise wasn't just about Charles's relationship with Diana's memory. It was about the kind of king he intended to become, and the kind of father he would be from that moment forward. Over the following weeks, as Britain mourned and the royal family navigated the unprecedented public outpouring of grief, William began to notice changes in his father. Charles's interactions with the public became noticeably warmer. He lingered longer at engagements, asked more personal questions, and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. During a walkabout in the days following Diana's funeral, William watched his father kneel down to speak with a young girl who had brought flowers. The old Charles would have offered a brief acknowledgement and moved on. Instead, he spent 5 minutes asking about her school, her family, and why she had wanted to come pay her respects to Diana. He started doing things Mother would have done, William explained in the interview. A small smile crossing his face. Not copying her exactly, but finding his own way to connect with people in a more genuine way. The promise also changed how Charles approached fatherhood. Previously formal and somewhat distant, he began making an effort to be more present in his sons' lives. He attended more of their school events, spent longer periods with them during holidays, and perhaps most importantly, he began talking to them about Diana in a way that celebrated her life rather than focusing on the complications of their marriage. Father started telling us stories about Mother that we had never heard, William recalled. Not the public Diana that everyone knew, but the private moments. How she used to practice her speeches in front of the mirror, making faces until she felt confident. How she would sneak into the kitchen at Kensington Palace to make us midnight snacks when we couldn't sleep. How she worried about whether she was doing enough to prepare us for our future roles. These conversations became a new family tradition. Charles would set aside time each week to share another memory, another glimpse into the Diana that only he had known as her husband and the father of her children. It was, William realized, his father's way of keeping the promise he had made beside her coffin. But the most profound change came in how Charles began to view his future role as monarch. Diana had always believed that the royal family should be more accessible, more willing to engage with contemporary issues, and more demonstrably caring about the welfare of their subjects. Charles had often disagreed with her methods, considering them too radical or undignified for royal protocol. Now, standing in the shadow of her death and carrying the weight of his whispered promise, Charles began to see the wisdom in Diana's approach. He started championing causes that she would have supported: homelessness, mental health awareness, and environmental protection. But more than just supporting these causes, he approached them with the kind of hands-on involvement that Diana had pioneered. Years later, when Charles finally became king, those who knew him well could trace the threads of his reign back to that moment in the chapel, to the promise made to a woman who had died too young but whose vision for a more compassionate monarchy lived on in the man who had loved her imperfectly but learned from her completely. William concluded this part of his revelation by noting that the promise wasn't just about honoring Diana's memory. It was about Charles's recognition that he needed to become a better man, a better father, and eventually, a better king. The whispered words beside Diana's coffin became the blueprint for the rest of his life. 26 years had passed since that whispered promise in the chapel, and Prince William sat in his study reflecting on how profoundly those words had shaped not just his father's reign, but his own understanding of what it meant to be royal in the modern world. The documentary cameras captured every nuance of his expression as he prepared to reveal how King Charles had spent decades fulfilling his commitment to Diana's memory. The transformation wasn't immediate, William explained, his voice carrying the weight of decades of observation. Change within the monarchy happens slowly, carefully, but looking back now, I can trace a direct line from that promise to the kind of king my father has become. The first major test of Charles's commitment came just months after Diana's death, when he was faced with decisions about how to raise William and Harry as single father. The old Charles might have relied entirely on nannies and boarding schools, maintaining the emotional distance that had characterized royal parenting for generations. Instead, he made choices that honored Diana's more hands-on approach to motherhood. Father started coming to school plays, football matches, and parent-teacher conferences, William recalled, with obvious affection. He would arrive in his official car with security details, causing quite a stir. But he came. Mother had always made sure she was present for the important moments in our lives, and Father was determined to continue that tradition. But Charles's commitment to the promise went far beyond parenting. As the years passed, His public engagements began to reflect a distinctly different approach to royal duty. Where previous generations of royals had maintained careful distance from controversial subjects, Charles began using his platform to address issues that Diana had cared about deeply. Mental health became a particular focus. Diana had been one of the first public figures to openly discuss depression and eating disorders, breaking down barriers around topics that had been considered too sensitive for royal involvement. Charles took up this cause with a dedication that surprised many observers, funding research initiatives and speaking candidly about the importance of mental health support. He once told me that Mother would have been proud to see how far the conversation around mental health had progressed, William shared. But he also said that her death had taught him that mental health struggles can affect anyone, regardless of their position or privilege. The promise he made beside her coffin included a commitment to continuing her work in this area. The promise also influenced Charles's approach to his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. Many expected him to either remain unmarried or to handle any future relationship with the kind of discretion that might have avoided public scrutiny. Instead, Charles chose to be transparent about their relationship, gradually introducing Camilla to public life and eventually marrying her in a ceremony that, while modest by royal standards, acknowledged the reality of his feelings without diminishing Diana's memory. Father told me that part of learning to love the way Mother loved meant being honest about his own heart, William explained. He said that Mother would have wanted him to be happy, and that hiding or being ashamed of his relationship with Camilla would have betrayed the spirit of openness that Mother had tried to bring to the royal family. This transparency extended to how Charles addressed his past with Diana. Rather than allowing their story to be defined entirely by others, he began speaking more openly about their relationship, acknowledging his mistakes while celebrating Diana's contributions to the monarchy and to their sons' lives. The most visible manifestation of Charles's promise came with his accession to the throne. King Charles III's coronation was notably different from previous royal ceremonies, reflecting many of the values that Diana had championed. The guest list included representatives from charities and community organizations, rather than exclusively traditional nobility. The ceremony itself incorporated elements designed to make it more accessible to the general public, with live streaming and interactive elements that brought ordinary citizens into the celebration. Mother always believed that the monarchy belonged to the people, not the other way around, William reflected. Father's coronation was his way of showing that he had internalized that lesson. Perhaps most significantly, King Charles's reign has been characterized by a level of emotional openness that previous monarchs would have considered inappropriate. He speaks frankly about grief, about learning from mistakes, and about the challenges of balancing tradition with the need for institutional evolution. During a recent speech at a mental health charity event, Charles referenced Diana directly, saying, "I learned from my late wife that true strength comes not from hiding our struggles, but from acknowledging them and seeking help when we need it. She taught me that vulnerability is not weakness. It is the foundation of genuine connection with others." William paused in his interview, clearly moved by the memory. That speech would have been unthinkable from a British monarch even 20 years ago, but Father has kept his promise to learn how to love the way Mother loved, openly, without reservation, without fear of judgment. The promise has also influenced William's own approach to royal duty. As second in line to the throne, he has embraced Diana's legacy of hands-on involvement in charitable work, particularly in areas of homelessness and environmental conservation. But more than just continuing her causes, William has adopted the emotional openness that Charles learned to value after Diana's death. "I've never tried to hide my struggles with mental health following Mother's death," William said. "Father taught me that sharing our vulnerabilities makes us more effective leaders, not less. That was one of Mother's greatest gifts to our family. The understanding that being royal doesn't mean being perfect." As the interview drew to a close, William reflected on the broader impact of his father's whispered promise. 26 years ago, my father made a commitment beside my mother's coffin that changed not just his own life, but the future direction of the monarchy. Every time I see him at a public engagement, genuinely connecting with people, I remember those words he spoke when he thought no one was listening. The promise, William revealed, had become more than just a personal commitment to Diana's memory. It had become a blueprint for a more compassionate, more accessible, more human form of monarchy. King Charles III's reign, still in its early years, bears the unmistakable influence of lessons learned from a woman who died too young, but whose vision for royal service continues to shape the institution she once struggled to change from within. Mother wanted the monarchy to have a heart, William concluded, his voice filled with quiet pride. Father promised her that it would, and he has spent the last 26 years making sure that promise was kept. Now it's my generation's responsibility to continue that work, to ensure that when we serve the people, we do so with the same love and compassion that Mother showed to everyone she met. The red recording light finally dimmed, and Prince William sat quietly for a moment, surrounded by the memories that had shaped his understanding of duty, love, and the complex legacy of a promise whispered in grief, but fulfilled through decades of patient, purposeful change. The secret was finally shared, not as gossip or revelation, but as testimony to the enduring power of love to transform even the most traditional institutions when guided by genuine commitment to serving others.